It's been a while since I last tackled a bolt action painting tutorial, but with the November edition of Wargames Illustrated, including a sprue of Wargames US Marines, I thought that it would be a good time to revisit the game. I'm Pete the Wargamer, and in this video I'll be showing you how to paint USMC camouflage patterns. The first step in painting is to prime, and this model was no exception. Applying primers helps to create a surface that paint can properly adhere to, as well as creating a uniform colour to start the painting process against. I primed this particular model with a grey airbrush primer, but there are many different colours and methods available, be it aerosol, airbrush or brush on, and what you use is entirely up to you and what you have available. As is the colour. I chose to use a grey primer here as it would allow me to more easily apply the numerous brown and green tones of the model. During World War II, some US Marines were issued with a reversible camouflage jacket and trousers. One side featured a green camo and the other a sand. I tackled both of these camouflage patterns on this model, but I started with the sandy colour. But before I could apply any paint, I needed to first thin it out. I added a small amount of Monster Brown to my wet palette and mixed in a little bit of water, creating a roughly 2-to-1 mixture of paint and water. By creating a thinner mixture of paint, when I came to paint this on the jacket, I was able to apply the paint much more easily. In addition to this, as the paint was a little thinner, I could allow the first application to dry and then apply a second layer over the top. By layering the paint like this, I was able to achieve a really solid brown colour without the unsightly bumps and brush strokes that applying unthin paints can sometimes create. Once I had completed the application, I was left with an excellent starting point of the sand camouflage. After the base coat, I wanted to create a little definition in the jacket, and to do this I applied a lighter paint. To create this paint, I took some of the Monster Brown that I had used in the last step and mixed it with a little of the pale yellow of Arid Earth. This created a much lighter paint that was still of a similar hue to the base paint. I applied this mixture over the fabric, focusing my application over the raised details and areas, keeping the original, darker base coat only visible within the recesses. By keeping these folds darker, I created the appearance of shadows, giving a sense of depth to the miniature's surface. Once I had finished applying this coat, I was left with an excellent starting colour for the sand camo that I could then start to apply the camouflage patterns to. The camouflage pattern consisted of several different brown hues, and the first of these that I chose to tackle were some of the mid-brown patches, the ones that were only slightly darker than the base colour. For this I chose to use some leather brown. I took a fine-tipped brush and used this to apply a series of irregular sized blobs over the jacket. I tried to keep them fairly evenly distributed across the whole model as I did this, but didn't worry about keeping an exact distance between each of the blobs. For the next colour, I chose a more yellowy brown in the form of desert yellow. This was applied in the exact same way as the previous step. However, as the yellow was a little lighter than the base colour, I did find myself needing to apply a second layer in some places in order for the yellow to stand out a little more. The final step for the sand camo saw me using the reddish brown of Dirt Spatter. This is much darker than the other browns I had used up to this point, so I needed to ensure that I didn't apply it too heavily and overpower the other browns that were already present. Again, I followed the same patching technique, trying to keep some sort of even distribution of unevenly shaped blobs. At this stage, I completed the sand side of the camo, at least for the time being, and was ready to move on to the green. I began with a base coat of Army Green. This was thinned out in the same way as the Monster Brown and was applied over both the trousers and the helmet cover. As before, I wanted to give the green camo a little definition, and so went about creating a mixture of Army Green and some Arid Earth. Much like before, I added just enough Arid Earth to the Army Green to create a lighter shade. This was then applied over the fabric. I focused over the raised folds and surfaces, leaving the darker Army Green just in the recesses. The result is a better definition of the material and a better level of detail overall. With the base colours of the green camouflage completed, I could start to apply the actual pattern. For the first group of patches, I chose Commando Green. It's slightly more olive than the army green and arid earth base colour that I'm applying it over, so it should stand out quite nicely. Again, I focused on keeping the patches irregularly shaped, but fairly evenly spread out. The next green I used was Greenskin. This particular green was much brighter and richer, and so stood out against the more subdued colours that I'd used up to this point. The next two steps saw me using the same colours as I had done before. First was Desert Yellow. As before, this lighter yellowy brown colour did need a couple of coats to really help these particular patches to stand out over the green. Finally, I used Dirt Spatter once again as the final set of camouflage patches. Against the greens I'd used so far, this rich reddish brown would really stand out. And with the application of the Dirt Spatter finished, I had completed the camouflage patterns. However, I wasn't quite finished painting these areas just yet. I wanted to apply a wash of soft tone over all the camouflage fabric, but personally I prefer to thin out my washes a little. I mixed some soft tone with roughly equal parts quick shade mixing medium to create a much less intense wash that would create a more subdued appearance. This mixture was then applied over all of the camouflage fabric. The intention of this wash was twofold. The first was to help to boost that shading that I had started with the initial layers. The wash would flow into the recessed areas, further darkening them down and boosting the contrast between light and dark. Secondly, the wash slightly stained the surface with a thin layer of translucent brown. This helped to weather the fabric by giving it a slightly faded appearance, whilst also making it appear a little dirty. Once the wash had dried, I then set about tackling the rest of the model, using the same techniques that I'd used in my previous US Marine tutorial, which you can find a link to on screen now. And with that done, here we have the completed US Marine from Wargames bolt action range. As I mentioned before, you'll find a USMC sprue in the November edition of Wargames Illustrated, so keep an eye out that flat magazine in your local newsagents if you'd like to try out any of these techniques. You can find a full list of all the paints that I've used in this tutorial in the description below, along with any other equipment that I've used to create this video. So, as always, I just want to say a big thank you to all of my supporters and the folks who use my affiliates links. If you'd like to help me out with making these videos, you can support me on Buy Me a Coffee as a one-off or as an ongoing membership. You can find a link to that below. Your help is always greatly appreciated, and if you like this video, then please do check out my other painting guides and please do consider subscribing. And so, until next time, thanks for watching and goodbye.